talk about, so let's get to our panel. Steve Pruitt is a former staff director for the U.S. House Budget Committee. He's currently with Watts Partners here in Washington, D.C. Sitao is a chief economist and partner at Deloitte China. He joins us from Beijing. And with us from Philadelphia is Michael Johns. He is the co-founder of the U.S. National Tea Party movement and a former speechwriter for U.S. President George H.W. Bush. And economist Yukon Huang is the author of a new book, Cracking the China Conundrum, Why Conventional Economic Wisdom is Wrong, and he joins us in the studio as well. There's so much to talk about because the US is going through one of these generational changes when it comes to the tax code. Steve Pruitt, what does this mean for the average American taxpayer and companies, and also the rest of the world, because it is the biggest economy still?
Well, I would say for the average taxpayer, not much. $1,000 is what they're promising, or roughly $1,000, $1,200 a year, which equates to about $100 of additional spending power for the average consumer. That's not much money.
What about rich people? They're getting more, right?
Rich people do relatively well in this plan. I think it's short-term lived. I think the fact that they're going to borrow over $1 trillion to give rich people a tax cut is problematic in the long term, because
this is the part where it's been scored that it could add $1.5 trillion to the deficit of the US. Yes.
And the fact that they're going to borrow that, probably from China, is going to be problematic over the long term, not necessarily in terms of the direct impact on what the average person will have to pay over the years to reduce the deficit, but in terms of what it's going to cost those rich folks who are in business, who are then in turn going to be going out looking for financing, spending in the international economy. All of those effects really have not even been touched in any of this discussion right now.
Michael, just want to come to you next, but first of all, let's, tax reform has been a key policy agenda item of Donald Trump, the administration, and the Republican-controlled Congress, and they could barely conceal their delight when it was passed because it was pretty close as well. Let's have a listen to the U.S. president.
If you look at it, we're going to grow the country. We're going to grow jobs. We're going to be growing everything. We have companies now that are pouring back into our country, even before this. We've just set records in so many different ways. We've set records with every conceivable, if you look at it, consumer confidence at a 17-year high, and I think it's an all-time high, consumer confidence. Business confidence, all-time high. Everything is like at an all-time high, including the big one. It's called the stock market.
A very confident Donald Trump there, Michael Johns. Look, people are going to dispute the facts and the figures, but he has a point that this is what they were brought in office to do. But the question is, the U.S. economy seems to be doing fine without these tax cuts. Unemployment is at historic lows at 4.1%. GDP growth is good. Wages are starting to rise. Does the U.S. economy need a big tax cut, especially for corporations, when the stock market is at all-time highs?
It does. I mean, for multiple reasons. I mean, one thing that I've been talking about since we launched the Tea Party movement in 2009 is so-called corporate inversion, and the fact that there's roughly $3 to $4 trillion that are sitting offshore for no other reason than the fact that we cannot have that money repatriated at anything lower than the 35%. With the passage, which is a great political success for the GOP, of this tax package, bringing that down to 20%, we should see a lion's share and maybe all of that come back in the U.S., which will be very stimulating for job creation. Additionally, it may be true that the impact, as my colleague said, on an average worker is a few $1,000s by cutting the rate from 15 to 12 for middle-income workers, but you're doubling the standard deduction, you're doubling the child tax credit, and the lion's share. This is the political dilemma in explaining tax policy to the American people. Is that I don't think it's widely appreciated that roughly 60% of our total tax revenue is paid by the top 5% of earners. So when you cut rates, inevitably it's very difficult for them not to be beneficiaries. However, unlike previous Republicans in their rhetoric and policy, I think President Trump has been correct in designing this policy in a way that is going to help middle-income America, because that is the area of our country that's been hurting the most. We still have 95 million Americans not in the workforce. We have GDP under President Obama that for the first time since it's been recorded had not grown in excess of 3%. Trump now has it over 3% GDP. Jobs are being created, 240,000 roughly in November, over roughly 1.5 million since he's taken office. So things are moving in the right direction, and this should be additionally stimulating. Okay, well, we're going to come back to you on more of that, but I want to sort of widen it out globally, of course, because the US is the biggest economy in the world. What it does fiscally and monetarily obviously affects the world. Sitao in Beijing, from where you're sitting, what does this mean for the US's competitiveness and how US corporations behave globally?
I think this is going to enhance the competitiveness of the US companies. I think the challenge for China is what's going to happen to those subsidiaries of US companies. Are they going to repatriate fund, as the previous guest was suggesting? If that's the case, what should China do? In addition to that, if you look at the reaction from the credit market, so far we have not seen the spike of long-term interest rate, but credit market could be wrong. So if the Federal Reserve has to raise interest rate more than due to certain fiscal slippage, in the short term at least, I think the greenback could get a push. So what's going to happen to the RMB exchange rate? Right. And of course, we know, the downward pressure on the Chinese currency needs to be managed. So these are all the challenges I think China has to face.
That's a good point, Sitao, that if all this money comes flooding back from abroad into the US, it could push up the dollar, put pressure on the RMB. China is trying to actually move its currently up the value chain. It's going to be interesting. Yukon Huang, do you believe that American companies will do what the Trump administration says and pull billions of dollars out of the European Union, pull it out of Asia, bring it back here? What are the incentives for that? Or are we really looking at some sort of competitive dance between the major regions when it comes to tax policy?
Oh, at the margin, since it has become cheaper to bring money back, some money will flow back. Right. But how much is the big question? There are estimates of $10 to $50 billion, for example, parked in China.
50 billion?
Yeah. But much of it is actually needed for operational purposes, so only a small fraction of that, a couple billion, might actually come back. So the big question for companies will continue to be, what do I want to do with this money? You bring it back because you want to actually use it in some way. In that sense, I don't think that the impact will be that significant. Actually, there's a lot of money floating around. Interest rates are quite low. Companies are not actually strapped for funding to invest. They are not investing as much as people would wish because demand or consumption or investment needs are not that great yet. The economy is already at full capacity, so they're not quite clear what they would actually need to do with this kind of funding here. I think the big issue is the exchange rate. And this will certainly lead to an appreciation of the exchange rate. The deficit increase combined with the increase in the exchange rate essentially means that America's trade deficit is going to get larger.
And that's going to be more political pressure on the Trump administration.
Actually, because that's one of the twin objectives they're trying to say. We want to reduce the trade deficit, and they're concerned very much about the trade deficit with China or with Mexico or with Canada or with Europe. This will only make it worse. So the interesting question is, if it becomes worse, the question, what will they blame it on?
Well, let me just, I'm going to come to you in a minute, but let's finish this point. So essentially, if the dollar becomes more valuable, you can buy more Chinese goods with it, the trade deficit expands. That could cause a political problem for a White House that's saying America first, and we've got to narrow this gap, right?
Well, you could argue, in fact, that the trade deficit isn't really an important issue. The White House,
but they don't.
But they don't. Yeah. After all, if you think about it, America's had a trade deficit every year for 40 years in a row. And good times are bad times. And so the issue is, does it really matter? And I think this is actually overblown as an objective for the government.
I want to talk about China a bit more in a minute, but Mr. Pruitt, what do you think will happen with all this money? Do you think the Trump administration are going to succeed in getting all this billions parked abroad back into the U.S. to somehow stimulate the economy? And of course, there's an infrastructure element to this potentially as well.
Well, and that's one of the 2 points I'd like to make. Number one, I think there was some discussion earlier in the year about opening up repatriation and using the revenues that were generated for infrastructure, and that seems to have fallen off the table in terms of what's being discussed.
That's right. It was going to be $1 trillion or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Secondly, I think, contrary to what my colleague has indicated here on this panel, there are no signs from anywhere that the companies that are bringing back funds are going to otherwise turn those around and use those to generate jobs and more income.
So what are they going to do with it? Give it away to shareholders?
Shareholders primarily. They're going to reinvest in capital and in their own company infrastructures to update systems, to bring things online that maybe they've been wanting to do that they didn't have the cash at hand to do. So I don't see, and there's no signs out there that suggest that any of the workers are going to benefit significantly or at all.
Michael Johnson, can you respond to that? That these companies may bring some money back, but they'll reward their shareholders, won't necessarily invest. We are basically at full employment. You know, is this really time to be slashing taxes when the economy is humming along?
On the full employment, I think one thing that President Trump's been accurate about, again, our Tea Party movement's been consistent on, is that these Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers are very deceiving. There are tens of millions of Americans that are not in that number, that are not in the workforce who would be if they had the opportunity. Additionally, when we started looking at this tax package and how to structure it, there was an evaluation of a lot of historical examples, particularly in other countries. One prominent one was Canada in 2007, where they had made substantial provincial cuts in corporate rates, and they did see an increase in wages. Many other examples. I agree that that is going to be a determinant, and that's what's positive about this, is we're going to find out. I believe absolutely job creation needs to increase, wages need to go up. If those two things do not happen, then unfortunately my colleagues would be right that this was not the stimulative cure to our ills.